heritage, help define who we are, understand where we are coming from, and potentially allows us to forge a better future. However, the data suggests that they are also major economic sectors too. Figures from the UK's Department for Culture, Media and Sport, the DCMS, suggest that the cultural sector, which includes subsectors like performing arts, film, TV, music, museums, and historical sites, accounts for around 700,000 jobs and £31 billion in gross value added in the UK economy. So as such, policymakers charged with growing the creative industries, which includes the cultural sector, need access to high quality, timely data on supply and demand for arts, culture and heritage, just as they do for other important sectors. And this is why the Creative PEC has chosen to make the arts, culture and heritage sectors one of 4 priorities for our State of the Nation publication series, which produce consistent quantitative indicators to inform policies for the creative industries in all parts of the UK. So in this report, we analyse supply issues through the prism of the arts, culture and heritage workforce, and demand issues through engagement and participation data. But what constitutes the arts, culture and heritage sectors for the purposes of policy formulation is even more problematic here than it is in other areas of economic policy, for the simple reason that what art, culture and heritage means to one person can differ so greatly from another's. In today's report, you'll see that we've adopted a pragmatic approach and gone for where the high quality data that are publicly accessible and have official data sources can be found. Inevitably, this means that less formally organised activities are underrepresented, but importantly, this does not mean that they are any less significant for policy. We hope in future issues to address gaps in the data where we can through exploring more innovative, novel data sources so as to paint a more rounded and more nuanced picture. Our aim in these State of the Nations reports is to produce regular data-rich set-piece publications, which we hope will become key reference documents that policymakers and practitioners will go back to again and again. And in time, a sign of whether we have been successful in reaching these aims will be whether a perceived lack of data and evidence is no longer used as an excuse for policy inaction in this area. So, coming back to the report that we're launching today, with no further ado, let me hand you back to Bernard so we can hear more about the findings.
Great, thanks so much, Hassan. So in the next part of the session, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Mark Taylor. Mark is one of the lead researchers on this report, but also a senior lecturer in quantitative methods at the University of Sheffield, and also a PEC research partner on arts, culture and heritage. So Mark, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. My name, as Bernard says, is Mark Taylor. I won't introduce myself for a second time, but I am a white man in his late 30s with round black-rimmed glasses, mostly bald, wearing a white t-shirt under a grey overshirt in front of a largely blue background with some artwork and books on either side. So as Hassan is introduced, what we understand by arts, culture and heritage is quite a broad term. In this presentation, I'm going to be presenting quite a wide range of different bits of data. The full report, whose link should be circulated subsequently and also hopefully will get dropped into the chat relatively quickly, explains all of the decisions that were made, explaining why it is that we've focused on particular things. And so just to give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'll start with a bit of background. I'll then talk to you about what we might call engagement in arts, culture and heritage. And then I'll present some data about the workforce in arts, culture and heritage from a few different perspectives. And so starting with a bit of background. So one of the big motivations for this project was to try to understand the dynamics of audiences and workforces in arts, culture and heritage. You can pick your own metaphor. Some people prefer to use the language of supply and demand. Some people prefer an ecosystem approach in which different parts of the arts, culture and heritage are all feeding together. But broadly, we think this is a really important way of understanding the overall picture of what's going on. So without any further ado, I'll jump to start talking about what we might call engagement in arts, culture, and heritage. So the majority of this part of the presentation is drawn from data from the participation survey, which is run by the Department of Culture, Media and Sports, DCMS, which is very, very high quality data sets, understanding the ways that people are spending their time. I'll start just straight away with a bit of an overview of some data that DCMS has published themselves, which summarizes the rates of what you might call attendance, which is in blue, and participation, which is in green, in cultural activities in England. So where attendance we might think of as showing up to something, going to cinema, going to a gig, going to theatre, going to an art gallery. Participation includes things like painting or drawing or sculpture, photography, composing music, writing, and so on. We can see that within these activities, the most popular is reading, which is nearly 2/3 of the population reported doing in the year 22-23, when asked about what they'd done in the preceding 12 months. Smidge under half the population had been to the cinema. Around 1/3 had been to a gig or had been to some kind of theatrical performance. But we're very conscious that the period under discussion here was something that was heavily affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Both, there may have been restrictions on what people were able to do, but there also may have been uncertainty and discomfort about what people might have chosen to do, even if events were taking place. And for this reason, we've drawn attention to the way that this changed from the final quarter of 2021, so the period starting in October 21, when asked about the preceding 12 months, through to the first quarter of 2023, so up to March of last year. And there are three main patterns that I'd want to draw your attention to. So what we have is the lines correspond to our sort of best estimate of the central number, and the coloured areas refer to the margins of error, where we think that each of these values is within this range. I can talk about the maths if you're interested. It's very thoroughly covered in the report. And you might look at this and think that the margin of error is quite a bit greater around participation. But what's actually going on is that these numbers were broadly pretty consistent over the period. The number of people who said that they participated in crafts in the preceding 12 months, if you asked them around the end of 2021, was very, very similar to that number at the start of around 2023. The exception to this is photography as an artistic activity. My suspicion of what's going on here is that the number of people who are able to go on a beautiful holiday somewhere in the UK and take some photos as an artistic activity was greater at the end than at the start. But there are two other patterns that I draw your attention to. The first one is people attending something that involved going to a building at a particular time. So if you went to the theatre, if you went to a gig, then chances are that was indoors and at a particular time. And over the period from the end of 2021 through to the start of 2023, those numbers all more than doubled. By contrast, activities like going to an arts exhibition or a craft exhibition, those numbers increased as well, but not to the same extent. These weren't doubles. The participation survey doesn't only ask about what activities that we might sometimes describe as arts and culture. It also has some great questions on different heritage sites that people have visited. Obviously, visiting heritage sites is not all that encapsulates heritage, but I think it's an interesting indication of what's going on. So similar to what I showed you before, this shows you the percentage of people who had attended different kinds of sites, where around half the population had reported going to a National Trust site, and a bit over 40% of people, again, this is in England, reported going to a city or town with a celebrated historic nature, or a park or garden with historic or artistic features. So that's a start of what we're trying to unpack, as there are 30 graphs in the report. I'm not going to show you all of them. But one of the things that we're very interested in is to understand how different groups of people engage in different kinds of activities. And I'll show you two illustrations of these. There are 12 overall, I think, on the right in the report overall. And I'll start by talking a bit about how attendance participation, as I showed you earlier, varies between disabled people and people who aren't. And I'd start by pointing to activities that we might refer to as participation, which you can see in triangles. And most of these numbers are very, very similar to each other. We can see we've got these margins of error, which are illustrated. Where these margins of error overlap, that means that we can't conclude that there are any differences in the rates of participation between groups. And things like playing video games, reading, photography as an artistic activity, no difference between people who are and aren't disabled. Crafts, significantly larger fraction of the disabled population participated in crafts than of the population that isn't. But the opposite is true for attending different kinds of activities. The percentage of disabled people who did things like went to a gig, went to a theatrical performance, went to a comedy event, those are all significantly lower for disabled people. Overall, about 39-ish% of disabled people didn't attend any of the events that are included here. Those are the things that we noted as circles, compared with about 23% of people who aren't disabled. Similarly, I can draw your attention to understanding how attendance at heritage sites varies between people from different ethnic groups. These margins of error are quite a bit bigger because the percentages of people in the data set from different ethnic groups varies a bit, but we can see, for example, that about 41% of white people said that they've been to a historic landscape or habitat, which is significantly larger number than any mixed people of mixed or multiple ethnic groups, Asian or Asian British people, Black or Black British people, and anyone from any other ethnic group. It's also noteworthy that Black people were significantly less likely to attend historic landscape or habitats than any of those other ethnic groups. And then finally, in this section, I just want to draw your attention to some of the differences between the four nations of the UK. I'm a little bit cautious about inferring anything too strongly from this figure. The way that data is collected in the different nations of the UK, there's some variation. The timing differed slightly, so I'm a little bit cautious about inferring too much. My favorite data point on this is that the percentage of people who reported participating in dance in Scotland is way, way, way higher than in the other three nations. So as I say, there's lots and lots of data about cultural engagement in the report. That's just a flavour of what we're gesturing towards. So next, I'll talk a little bit about arts, culture and heritage of workforces. So for a long time, I have been interested in the makeup of who's working in arts, culture and heritage, often with a focus through social class backgrounds, gender, ethnicity and disability. But in this area, one of the other things that's really important is understanding the composition of the freelance workforce, understanding how many of the freelancers working in the sector, how many people working in these occupations are freelance. So I'm going to talk about two different data sources, as I say. The Labour Force Survey covers the entire UK and is a quarterly survey, which allows us to monitor how things change over time over fairly short periods. People are often very interested to understand whether particular shocks to the sector, such as the pandemic, have made a difference. And anyone who was watching Channel 4 News yesterday might be aware that the percentage of people from working class backgrounds in film, TV, video, radio, and photography, our estimate is that this is now a little bit lower than 10%, but it's worth flagging again that there is a margin of error around all of these estimates. For me, the real story here is actually one of continuity, where we don't seem to see very big changes. We can see this at the bottom of the screen. We don't seem to see very big changes in the social class composition of these occupations, in spite of interventions aiming to change things. In terms of some of these other things that I'm drawing attention to, again, largely we seem to see a story of stability rather than transformation. One possible exception to this is that the percentage of men working in film, TV, video, radio, and photography occupations seem to have dipped a little bit during 2023. This is something that we are keeping an eye on, and we're committed to updating this data through the current phase of the PEC. But that's one way of understanding arts, culture, and heritage workforces. I'll now talk about a second one. So one of the things that's really exciting is that the 2021 census, the next few slides that I'll talk about relate to England and Wales, but I'll come to talking about Northern Ireland and then Scotland in a moment, allows really heavy-duty interrogation. And so for me, this is exciting for two main reasons. The first one is that it allows us to talk about specific occupations in a bit more detail. Earlier, just now, I was telling you about groups of occupations that I might call things like music, performing, and visual arts. With the detailed census offers, I can do things like distinguish between musicians and dancers. The second thing that's really exciting about the census is the opportunity to talk about what's going on at a more local level. Again, I can't show you everything. This is to give you a flavour of some of the dynamics that we talk about. And so I'll start by talking about the balance of men and women in 12 different arts, culture, and heritage occupations. You can see there's something labelled all other occupations, which is around the middle, which is highlighted with a black border, so that people can get a sense of how arts, culture, and heritage occupations differ from other occupations. And what I'd highlight here is I'd start by highlighting two poles. I mentioned this big category that we call arts, culture, music, performing, and visual arts. We can see that about 80% of dancers and choreographers are women, whereas upwards of 70% of musicians are men. And these are two occupations that are within that same big category. And I think this highlights the importance and the value of being able to interrogate this in a bit more detail. But also draw attention to the fact that about 2/3 of people in this category are referred to as managers and directors in the creative industries, and men as well. If anyone's looking at these occupations and thinking, these look a little bit odd, I'm not sure why these are phrased in this way, these are derived from standard occupational classification schema, which means they're consistently comparable with other data sources. So that's one example of what we can do. Similarly, I would draw attention to the numbers of people, percentages of people from different ethnic groups in each of these occupations. The majority of arts, culture, and heritage occupations, but not quite all of them, have larger percentages of people from who are white than all other occupations. The two exceptions are actors, entertainers, and presenters, and authors, writers, and translators. Authors, writers, and translators, that's the only occupational group with a higher than average percentage of Asian people. There's not a lot in it. Actors, entertainers, and presenters, the only occupational group with a higher than average percentage of Black people. We can also talk about disability. The way that disability is measured in the census is through two questions. Firstly, about whether people have any long-term conditions or impairments, and secondly, about whether this limits their day-to-day life, either a lot or a little. Majority of arts, culture, and heritage occupations have actually a smaller percentage of people who report no condition at all. That's the bit that's denoted in green. The exceptions to that are dancers and choreographers, arts officers and producers and directors, and managers and directors in creative industries. Artists, quite a large fraction of artists are disabled, either limited a lot or limited a little, relative to all occupations. As I said earlier, quite a lot has been written about axes, dimensions such as gender, ethnicity, disability, and also others. But the census also allows us to ask questions about some characteristics that maybe haven't had the same level of attention beforehand. I'm going to draw attention to two of these now. The first one is religious affiliation. A smaller percentage of people a large percentage of people in every single one of these occupations reports no religion relative to all other occupations. Only one of these occupations, that's authors, writers, and translators, has a large percentage of Muslims than the general population, the overall workforce, and Hindus are underrepresented in every single one of these occupations. Those are the second and third religions in terms of affiliation denoted in the census, whereas Christians are the largest religious group. There's slightly more Christians among librarians and dancers and choreographers than in all other occupations. final one of these that I'll show you is about sexuality, which is measured in the census. People can choose to not answer this question if they so choose. But we see that the percentage of people who report being heterosexual or straight is lower among people in every single one of these arts, culture, and heritage occupations. So that's who they are. Now we can show you where they are. It will probably not come as a surprise to a lot of people on this call that the local authorities with the largest percentage of people working in arts, culture, and heritage occupations are in London. Top 10 are all London. Brighton's in 12th. That's the first one outside. Sorry, Brighton and Hove. It's the first one outside of London. And we can zoom in to a bit more detail as well. This is an illustration of what things look like in London. This is an illustration of what things look like in Northern Ireland. And finally, this is an illustration of what things look like in Belfast. We can see a real corridor, if you like, down the Lisbon road. But you might be interested in places other than London and Belfast, and you might be interested in the geographic distribution of specific occupations rather than this big arts, culture, and heritage category that I've just described, which, as I've just shown, includes quite a lot of variety. And so the link that will be circulated later provides people the opportunity to do things like zoom in on different local authorities, choose particular occupations that they're interested in. It's me, so I'm going to show you what Sheffield looks like, but you can choose to zoom in to wherever you like to this level of detail. Similarly, if you are interested in those demographics that I just described, but you found yourself thinking that you wanted to understand how they fit together rather than just looking at one at a time, then that's something that the dashboards provide opportunities for as well. These dashboards are already live. If you go to the PEC website, that'll become available and the link should be circulated subsequently. I want to particularly give credit to Roshi Wang, who is the postdoctoral research associate working with us at Sheffield, who has done absolutely incredible work getting these all live. Everything that I've shown you just now is just a screenshot that I took this morning, but this is all something that you can work with yourselves. I'll wrap up by talking about what our plans are for the future. So I want to reinforce the value of measures that we can keep on top of, understanding things like the balance between men and women, between people from different social class backgrounds, but also the percentage of people attending, participating in different activities, and how that varies between different groups. I think we want to continuously monitor this so that we can understand how this is changing over time. And having a set of baselines is really important in order to understand whether things are going up, going down, variation in different places. But this isn't to say that the only things that we're interested in are things that we can tell you about every year. I hope that the case that I've made for the value of the census there is something that people are on board with. If you're not, let me give it another go. The census data was collected a year later in Scotland. It was collected in 2022 rather than 2021. All the planning that I've seen so far indicates that hopefully I'll be able to present relatively similar analysis to what I've just shown you now in a year's time. In England, we'll be able to tell you more about what's going on in terms of the local dynamics of attendance and participation, with data being available at a local authority level. But of course, official statistics, high quality surveys, the census are not the only sources of data that are of interest. And we're very much alert to opportunities throughout the entire arts, culture, and heritage portfolio. I will wrap it up there, and I'm very keen to hear what our panel has to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, for such a rich presentation. And I would absolutely echo the point that you made to not only look at the report, but if you're listening, definitely do have a look at those data dashboards as well. It really allows you to do incredibly rich kind of granular analysis on the things that you want to look at. So at this stage, what I'd like to do now is to turn to our panelists to explore some of the implications of the findings a bit further. We're running a couple minutes over, so I'm going to also try and bring in audience Q&A as quickly as possible. So if you haven't done already, please do start posting your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And before we dive in, I think it's worth acknowledging a point that Mark made, which is that we can see certainly some areas of continuity in terms of entrenched social inequalities within the data. And I think for those working to address these, it can certainly feel that there's been minimal shift in some areas that the report highlights. On the other side, though, I think the data that Mark has shared also presents a really nuanced picture. And we also know that there are some incredible initiatives underway at a grassroots, regional and national level, working to shift the dial. So what I'm hoping that we can do over the next sort of 20 or 30 minutes is not only to interrogate the data, but also to just surface opportunities for change, to learn from existing best practice, and also to ask how data and evidence can play an even greater role in this area. So to quickly introduce our panelists, we're delighted to be joined first by Peggy Hughes, who's Chief Executive of the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, by way of Northern Ireland and Scotland. She's also trustee of Age UK and Open Book and was previously chair of the Literature Alliance in Scotland. We're also joined by Shanaz Gulzar, an artist, creative producer and current creative director at Bradford City of 2025 UK City of Culture. I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about some of the work they're doing over there. Laura Ratnajara is a cultural consultant specializing in diversity, inclusion, and innovation and leadership across the culture, digital sectors. And really excited to hear a little bit as well about the work she's been doing on advisory groups across the wider cultural ecosystem. And then last but not least, Kelly Parish, who's Senior Manager of Diversity at Arts Council England, where amongst other things, her work includes supporting the delivery of the organisation's inclusivity and relevance investment principle and equality objectives. So I think just to start us off, I mean, the reports, as you've heard, looks at both audiences and workforces, but we know that those are interrelated and interdependent in a whole range of ways. And so Shanaz, I was really interested to hear from you about the work you're doing at Bradford City of Culture, where you're taking a really interesting approach to cultural production, which blurs some of the boundaries between those two groups. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, the work you're doing and how you're thinking about cultural production in the programme.
First of all, thank you to Mark for going through that data and kind of sharing it with us in such an accessible way. And for us to take it on. I'm having a couple of days of research and evaluation and data sets, actually. We've done our very first household survey, and we were going through that yesterday as well. And it's really interesting to see the synergies between this piece of research and what we've done on a local level across all 24 postcodes across the district. I think one of the first things I'm going to tell you a story that when I was in post, I'd been 3 months in post as creative director for 2025, and I was the chair of the bid. So I know the bid inside out. I know the district and the people inside out. And within 3 months of being in post, there was 3 of us who were fully full paid staff members, and we were recruiting the rest of the team. So to give you a sense of that, that was February last year. In May this year, we're at 97 staff team. So that's very steep, very fast growth. So we're a startup, but we're also a major institution organization as a UK City of Culture. And I had a fantastic woman from one of our community organizations called the African Caribbean Achievement Project come into the office and literally take us to task to say, what is our organization going to look like? Who is it going to represent? How representative is it? Who sat up on that floor? And after listening to her, I said, first of all, nice to meet you. Hello. Secondly, explained how far we were into the journey. And I said, thirdly, thank you for coming in so early and actually highlighting something that we are absolutely trying to do. But this is an extra push for us, because it means our communities that we are delivering a City of Culture to are looking at us, are seeing us, and are recognising that this is theirs as much as it is the sectors, as much as it is the team that is delivering. So actually being taken to task when at the time I said to her, I find it difficult to be taken to task when we're just starting the work, but equally thank you, because it reminds us how much it matters and how much it matters to the community that actually we're delivering to. So with that impetus ringing in our ears as we're starting the recruitment process for the team, it meant that immediately we were already looking at diversifying where we were recruiting and where all of our jobs and all of our roles are being advertised. It's really easy with the cultural industries to go straight to our sector, sites and where everyone goes to look for jobs. But if you are from, you know, backgrounds and families and communities who are not familiar, you could be the first one in your, you know, in your family to come into the arts. They won't know that you go which sites are and which pages and where you go to look for these roles. So actually then working with that same community organization, working with other community organizations, so absolutely working with our sector platforms, working with our community platforms, and with our university and college platforms to try and get the roles out as far and wide as possible. 15 months later, we have an incredibly diverse task force that is delivering 2025. It's also incredibly young. You know, Bradford is a very unique city and district. It's 26.3% under 20. That makes it the youngest city in the UK. An incredibly diverse city. It's, you come into the city centre, you see our diversity within our city centre. It's not just out in the outskirts and in the, you know, in the various areas that communities also create their spaces, but also it's within the city. So this team is representative of this city and district, and we couldn't do it responsibly and reasonably any other way, because also Claudia would find me again and have another conversation with me. But we equally needed to make sure that the team, which is representative of the district, which is then feeding into the programme, which is also has to be diverse, has to tell the stories of Bradford, has to respond to some of the asks that those communities have. A UK City of Culture is about the city and the context in which it's being delivered in. This is Bradford. It's 2025. It's a city and district, you know, within whatever's happening societally and nationally around us, but also what's happening locally. So telling those extraordinary stories, but also for the rest of the UK and welcoming the rest of the UK. So our approach, again, recognising that those people from a diverse, lower socioeconomic background sometimes look to the arts and go, how do I get there? You're there. We talk about if to be it, you have to see it, but you also not just have to be it and see it, but you also have to make sure that that route is there. You also have to demystify and make it less opaque. So we've approached it with three initiatives. The first was to bring a youth panel in. And so we've got 15 young people aged 16 to 22. That's quite a diverse age range, who are fully on board with us and have been since February this year around the business of arts and culture, the kind of the governance, the behind the scenes, everything that is absolutely necessary to deliver the work that we deliver. But sometimes the access point comes in from the making the work, creating the work, being seen. Actually, the business side of it is incredibly important, because that's how you'll get your creative directors, you'll get your managing director, you get your executive directors. So giving young people the opportunity to learn safely and learn best practice, she says, fingers crossed, because they're learning with us. So, you know, we're also kind of saying we're trying to bring best practice to this, to giving them that opportunity. So they're joining all in our subcommittees and our board and are working with us across the organisation. The second route, we are working with the apprenticeship levy. We have got 5 apprentices that have just started, and again, across the organisation and the business of the organisation. So tech, the behind the scenes of the production side of it, administrative, operational, audiences, creative, you know, all of it, to be able to learn as apprentices over the next 18 months with an extraordinary opportunity like this. And then the third route, because I can hear colleagues saying your entry levels are easy, your entry level are easy, your entry levels are easy. The third route is those, and it is young people, trying to create opportunity for those young people who have, and you don't have to have a degree for this. You don't have to have gone through, you know, an arts education or a further education or a higher education, but those who are actually making and creating work, those who are involved in it already. And it's those, that role is for 18 to 25. And those who have committed to be in the creative sector through their education and also their work that they've decided to do, how do you then create those routes? So it's about opportunity and access.
I think that point around routes into the sector feels really key. And, I think also routes of progression within the sector, we know is a continued challenge, particularly as we look at representation at more senior leadership levels. One part of the report obviously looks at socioeconomic class across both audience and workforce. And Peggy, I was quite interested to kind of hear from you in terms of your experience. You've worked across Northern Ireland, Scotland and England, working within a range of senior roles. And as someone from a working class background, what were some of the experiences and challenges and enablers that you found progressing into those senior roles in the sector?
Thanks, Bernard. I'll quickly say a little bit about how I look, if anyone would want to know how I look. I'm a small woman with short dark hair and spectacles, and I've made the foolish error of wearing a knitted tank top on a very warm day in London. Yeah, a lot of what Shanaz says really chimes, actually, even to the effect of you need to see it to be it is a very important kind of thing that I think wasn't the case coming from my background. And I think that comes down to kind of a basic kind of almost career literacy. If you can't see what those roles are, or you don't know they exist. In my case, I didn't know roles like these existed, to be honest, and nor did my family. I was the first from my family to go to university to study literature, which I'd always had access to books through libraries, but not to an understanding of the kind of galaxy that sits behind the production and the distribution and the consumption of books. I mean, that's a completely and remains, I think, quite a mysterious and mercurial concept to a lot of people, which is what in my job now I try to demystify a lot of that sort of background. And I think there are a lot of reasons for why it wasn't possible to sort of see those roles from where I was sitting. I was, my hometown is in the northeast of the north of Ireland, very far from some would say, kind of from the cultural centre of London. It was, in both means and opportunity. Then I was far out from that. Networks were a completely alien concept, if I'm honest. I mean, not only that they existed and how important they were and how many doors they opened and all of the rest of it, but almost like Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life level of mystery. They're an invisible fungi sitting underneath everything. I think also when you're from a working class context, the risk appetite is just really different. There is just a lack of safety net in terms of the choices you make. So, in fact, just the other day, I was reading a brilliant book called Assembly by Natasha Brown, which I recommend if you're interested in this area. She's writing about being a working class woman of colour. It's fictional, working class woman of colour in the finance sector. And there's a little quote that I just loved. It talks of people not coming from her background. They reach out knowing the ground beneath is soft, is soil and dandelions. And that's not how it is if you don't have the support network or the financial literacy or financial backing of a working class background. Then even if you do go to uni, I think your choices are usually probably conditioned by getting a job, getting a good job, making it worth your while, making it worth the money that was spent on you. Therefore, arts degrees aren't as standard a choice, perhaps. And certainly in my case, my family presumed I'd be a teacher, because what else on earth could you do with a literature degree? And then when you get the degree, it's assumed, that you've done the work, you've paid the money to get the education. A good job will definitely be yours. You'll have risen above the bowl you were baked in, and you will have a good job. So my grandmother, for example, was furious when I went back into a pub job after uni. She just couldn't understand how that was the case. So there are an awful lot of factors tied up in there that are conditioned by lots of things, by your family context, your values, your attitudes, your view, your vantage. So and I think some of the things that obviously worked for me, have been the opportunities to volunteer. Actually, at university, I did volunteer while working jobs at a festival, a poetry festival. It was the first time I'd even encountered a poetry festival. I knew that such a thing existed. And so I think there are definite much more to do in that area of giving working class people the sort of opportunity to see what those roles look like, to find out more.
That's great. Thanks so much, Peggy. And I think it's really interesting to think about the ways in which some of the kind of enablers that you highlighted, things like networks, visibility, access beyond the sector, are quite structural challenges. And I guess, Kelly, I'd really love to come to you on this because, you know, obviously a kind of key part of Arts Council England's work is about creating those enabling conditions, not only for individual organisations, but for the wider ecosystem to be able to tackle some of these. I can imagine, you know, well, data and evidence is obviously a key part of how you inform your decision making. And I'm very interested in a little bit about, what role data and evidence is playing in helping you to address some of these more structural challenges that you see across the sector.
Thanks, Bernard. Just for access, I'll give you a bit of a visual description. I'm a white woman in my very early 40s, I would say. And currently my hair is sort of blue and yellow and just long on one side. So it's not half a haircut, I'd say. And I've got a green jumper on, and I'm also quite warm, Peggy. And my pronouns are she, her. So data is magical. Mark, I really enjoyed your presentation. And the first thing I'm going to do when I get off this call is dive into the heat maps. I mean, it is fascinating to sort of see who we are and, you know, how we make up as a sector. And we can't do anything without data to back it up, particularly, you know, an organisation like Arts Council England, where we're investing millions of pounds of public money. So we have to be sure, and we have to be able to be transparent in setting our priorities and how we set out our decision making. And I don't specifically mean here the funding decisions that we make. I mean, every decision we make in our sort of daily life as an organisation, and the decisions we take in, excuse me, development, design, implementation of our work. You know, like I say, we're distributing public funds, so we have to show our rationale. So we love data, and I suppose anyone on this call, you know, if you're part of a national portfolio organisation, you will know how much we love data. We ask you to collect a lot of it, but that enables us to do what we do. You know, one of our equality objectives at the minute is around wanting to achieve a more equitable distribution of our investment, so to improve cultural representation and creative opportunities for everyone across England, specifically individuals and organisations from underrepresented protected characteristic groups and from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We know that historically the data tells us that's where we need to invest more money. And we can't achieve that without data to tell us who is included and who is excluded in the workforce in terms of opportunities, participation, and ultimately whose voices do inform the work that gets made and programmed and seen by everyone else. But in terms of limitations, data doesn't tell us everything. It is magical, but you know, it has its limits. It doesn't tell us about perception or feeling. It doesn't tell us about context, and particularly, data can't tell us anything if we don't have data. You know, there are gaps. There will always be gaps because sometimes people can't answer the questions that we pose, or sometimes people prefer not to share their data with us for whatever reason. You know, people might not always feel comfortable. People might not always feel safe in sharing their personal data. And that's, you know, entirely valid and entirely legitimate. Oh, sorry, my screen's just gone blank. Give me 2 seconds.
Sorry, Kelly, we can still hear you.
Brilliant. Okay. I'll keep going. So yeah, like I was saying, there are always, and there always will be gaps in data. And we acknowledge that, you know, that's a challenge. So I would say data is always a starting point. You know, it's a place for questioning and for probing. And like I said, there are many reasons why we don't have access to some data. And sometimes, you know, the narrative will be clear from the data we have. For example, in the data that you shared, Mark, you know, it's really interesting to kind of see some of the spaces in the visualizations where the trends are really clear. You know, you said that around 40% of disabled people hadn't attended an arts event or a cultural event in the past year. And we can see there's a stark correlation there in terms of events and sort of anything that involves physical access. And we can map that to other data that we have to know that, you know, physical and societal barriers, particularly in ticketing, particularly in access, really do make a difference there in terms of what people can and can't engage with. But sometimes the data raises more questions than it gives us answers, I suppose. And then, you know, sometimes there are particular communities that don't engage with particular art forms. And again, that might be totally legitimate. People might not want to engage with a certain art form. Not everybody, for example, loves mime as much as I do, and that's fine. No one has to go to a mime festival if they don't want to. I can do that on my own. But sometimes the data tells us that perhaps maybe people aren't engaging because they don't feel like they can, you know, they don't feel included, or there's a particular reason why, you know, there's underrepresentation in that area. And that's when it's kind of useful to kind of try and do a more qualitative deep dive rather than rely on the numbers. Like I said, data doesn't always give us enough context. And I think speaking specifically about what Arts Council are doing, you know, at the heart of Let's Create, there is that focus, yes, still on, you know, supporting excellent work, but we're in a framework that kind of looks at the qualitative value and sort of questions back to communities about what they want to see and why, and what is relevant to people and what's reflective of their experience and all of our experiences. So yeah, I think that's kind of data is fantastic, but you know, it's a good place to start asking questions, I think, is the real limitation there. Oh, I can see you all again now. That's nice.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And I think that's a lovely segue actually into some of the questions that we've had from the audience. And Lara, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this question. So I think building on that point around these sort of limitations on data, how can we bridge the gap between capturing the type of vital local knowledge that we need on the ground, particularly in programs like Bradford City of Culture, and feeding that into consistent national data that's available to inform policymaking? So I guess very broadly, be really interested in your thoughts on how do you get that right mix of you know, the sort of official statistics and that on the ground more qualitative insight that Kelly's mentioning?
Hi, Jason. I know the person who asked that question. So just to introduce myself, I'm Lara Ratnaraja. I'm a Sri Lankan Asian woman with pink hair, a lot of piercings. I have a black T-shirt with the lines from Pulp's Common People. If you called your dad, he could stop it all, because that's the most apt thing to be wearing for this session. And I have a background with a lot of art in it as well. I want to kind of come back a step, because the thing about collecting all the data is we're still operating in a sector that has systemic bias. So if we kind of just add the data, even when we're talking about Shanaz has local data and then we have formally collected data, we're still making a lot of assumptions around what constitutes culture, what constitutes data, what is relevant, what is recognised, and what has value. And I think because we're still talking about the formally funded cultural sector, we're othering all the other kinds of data that are being collected outside those formal structures. So Arts Council data is one thing. Mark, I love census data, as you know, so I use census data quite a lot in how we talk about place-based working. So I don't think it's actually a question of kind of like just putting these two things together. I think we need to take a step back and say that we can't analyze culture and workforce and cultural programming without recognizing that all of this is set up in a completely culturally elitist fashion anyway, and then the data is then kind of analyzing things and structures that don't work, because none of the data that Mark has presented even shows what England and Wales look like as countries. We have a workforce that doesn't even compare with the rest of the national workforce. So when we start looking at data, it isn't just putting them all together. We need to start unpacking some of the assumptions and the biases that are being made. I think also when we look at how we collect data, there's no reference to any kind of intersectionality. So you're either Asian or working class, or you're black or middle class, or you're white and disabled, and there's nothing around sexuality and gender that absolutely informs all of this. And the biggest barrier that you can see through all of this is about the class assumptions that are made either in culture or when we start talking about analysing data. So we have to kind of look at both of these things together. We can't just look at the analysis, because the analysis is already inherently bringing its own kind of assumptions and assuming that the standard of culture that we have in this country at the moment that is being analysed is the standard that we should be accepting. I can go on about this for ages, by the way.
That's great. No, thank you, Lara. And I think that's a really helpful challenge for thinking about how we measure and assess some of these issues. And you know, I think equally that starts to really open up as well into some of the kind of questions on the data and research. I'd love to bring Mark back into the conversation. I think a kind of related question that we've got from the Q&A is, you know, is there space, to what extent does the research critically interrogate simplifications in some of the official data sets? And I guess, Mark, could also be maybe kind of build that out a bit to think about what do you see as some of the constraints in terms of the official classifications here, and where do you might see some of the opportunities for new research that might start to reflect on some of those challenges that Lara has raised? So big question, but would love your thoughts.
Thanks, Bernard. What a treat. So there's a few things I can talk about in relation to this. So I'll maybe start with this question about, you know, what is it that we can and can't do with the data that we're working with. So there's a related question that actually came up in the chat, which was, you know, how did I select these occupations? If I wanted to know about people working in video games, like game designers, how do they compare with musicians and artists and so on. So I love the Office for National Statistics, I do, but they can't give us everything. And I'm afraid that game designer as an individual what's called standard occupational classification or SOC code is not something that I have access to. And so the sorts of work that we're presenting here, there are some occupations that we can tell you about in quite a bit of detail. There are others that unfortunately you might describe as having slipped through the cracks. There are other means that we can look at some of this stuff. I know that one of my colleagues on PEC, who I won't name because I don't want to commit anyone else to doing anything, has been doing some really interesting work with data sets that involve looking at how organizations describe themselves on their own websites and inferring things on that basis. So there's a little bit of an opportunity there. Similarly, the sort of classifications about what are the activities that people do and don't get asked about if they're completing a survey about their own cultural engagement. There are opportunities there, but again, I think we need to be a little bit strategic and a little bit sort of take opportunities where they can from lots of different data sources, including things like, everything's got its own pros and cons, but looking at transactional data, things like who's buying tickets, provides us with opportunities to understand things in a slightly different way. I want to pick up Laura's point as well about, basically you can only be one thing at a time, where we were only ever looking at one characteristic. All of the graphs that I showed you pretty much broke down occupations by a single characteristic. There are two things. So firstly, yes. Secondly, so the dashboards that I trailed, we can at least do, I know that responding with, you can be more than one thing at a time. You can be a maximum of two things at a time. Doesn't resolve all of the problems that are under discussion, but it at least raises some opportunities to understand diversity in a slightly more rounded way than what's been presented so far. And then similarly, the analysis that I showed of participation survey of who's engaging in different ways, so far that was only breaking by individual characteristics, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to unpack that in quite a bit more detail. That's a completely reasonable point, and I think that's something that we're very keen to do throughout the lifetime of the PEC. Thanks
so much, Mark. So a couple other questions from the audience that I'm hoping that we can try and capture before 1 o'clock. So next question is a bit about place and geography. So was place and or location seen to be more or the same amount of a barrier to entry and progression into the cultural workforce compared to other factors that are analysed in the reports? Mark, maybe we'll come to you first, but I'd also, Peggy, I know that place was part of your initial remarks. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question as well. So Mark, is there anything you'd like to add? And then Peggy, do jump in.
It's a bit tricky. So we haven't quite framed it to the same extent, sort of, where we show X% of people in a given occupation or in a given location. I'm slightly uncomfortable saying that something is more or less of a barrier. Like, I never sort of want to articulate this in terms of like a competition where groups that are sort of face different challenges or might have different opportunities are set in competition with each other rather than acknowledging the simultaneous roles of lots of different things. But certainly, I think geography is really important. Like, I can't emphasize enough how heavily a lot of these occupations are spatially concentrated.
Thanks, Mark. I've seen Laura's got her hand up as well. So Laura, I'll come to you, and then Peggy, if you have anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I wasn't particularly criticising the lack of intersectionality in your reporting of the data, by the way, Mark. My issue is that whenever we talk about diversity in the sector, it's always a deficit, and therefore it's always like so when we say, oh, there aren't enough Asian people or there are not enough queer people or disabled people, then it's like then there's a whole load of schemes to help do that without changing what the cultural sector actually does, which is that it is exclusive, it is elitist, it is not accessible, and it doesn't really think in that kind of way. And those are the issues for me also when we talk about place-based working is it's not just about the place, it's about understanding the history and the context of the place. So a lot of the census data I look at, I work in Birmingham. I'm sorry, I live in Birmingham, I don't work in Birmingham. I live in Birmingham, which has had a massive, significant, ethnically diverse shift in terms of the census data in the last 10 years. But if I talk to some of the arts populations, they have no understanding of what that looks like. And that includes ethnicity, includes class, includes gender, and includes sexuality. So I think for me, it's actually how people are using the data in a more informed way and looking at participation and attendance, because they are the things that are not being linked together. So it wasn't really to criticize that, but I think also linking that back to place is there are assumptions being made about places and about ethnicities and about gender and about sexuality because of how people are reading into that data in the first place.
So much, Lara. And I think there's also kind of interesting kind of resonance as well with some of the things, Shanaz, that you shared as well on Bradford City of Culture and that kind of holistic approach to place that you've taken. So I've seen the time. We're almost at 1 o'clock already, and I know there's a load more things that we could unpack, but I'm really keen to make sure that all of you are able to get to your lunch breaks and the rest of the days on the time that we kind of scheduled for this event. So just to kind of wrap up, I'd just like to emphasize, first of all, that if we haven't had a chance to answer your question today, please do feel free to drop us an email at info@pec.ac.uk. And if we can, we'll direct your question to the right person to respond. Just to say that do bear with us, because these launches generate a lot of interest and we're quite a small team, so it can take us a little bit of time to get back to you. If you have any other feedback on the event today, we'd also be really grateful to hear it. And we're really keen to improve these launch events over time and make sure they're as engaging and interesting and useful for all of you as possible. And then lastly, just to say as well that we'll be circulating a link to this report and the interactive data dashboards that Mark mentioned at the end of the event as well. So very lastly, I just wanted to say a huge thanks to the researchers behind this report, colleagues that have been involved in organising this event, and of course our panelists as well for their insights and contributions to the conversation. And lastly, a huge thank you as well to all of you in the audience for joining us today. We very much look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thanks so much, everyone.